The photograph is everywhere. You've seen it on t-shirts and dorm room walls, on coffee mugs and protest banners, in Havana and in shopping malls 10,000 miles from Cuba. The face stares out with quiet intensity, beret tilted slightly, hair wild, eyes fixed on something beyond the frame. It is the most reproduced image in the history of photography, and the man it depicts has been dead for more than half a century. His name was Ernesto Guevara de la Serna. The world knows him as Che. That single syllable, Che, has become shorthand for revolution itself. It adorns the walls of leftist collectives and the merchandise of multinational corporations. It is invoked by guerrilla fighters in the Colombian jungle and advertising executives on Madison Avenue. The man has become a symbol so potent that he has almost ceased to be a man at all. But he was a man, a complicated, contradictory, deeply human man. He was an asthmatic Argentine doctor who became one of history's most celebrated guerrilla commanders. He was a romantic idealist who ordered executions without flinching. He was a loving father who abandoned his children to chase revolution across continents. He was a Marxist theorist who believed in the transformative power of moral incentives, and a practical leader who watched those theories fail. Tonight, we peel back the icon to find the person underneath, not to worship him as his admirers do, not to condemn him as his critics demand, but to understand him, to trace how a sickly boy from an Argentine provincial town became the face of global rebellion, and what his life and death reveal about the promises and costs of revolutionary commitment. Before we begin this journey, a gentle note. If these evening explorations of remarkable lives help you unwind, please consider taking a moment to like and subscribe. It genuinely helps other curious minds discover these stories, and we're always interested in your reflections. Let us know in the comments what Che Guevara means to you, or which historical figure you'd like us to explore in our next bedtime biography. Now, as the day releases its hold and the quiet hours approach, let us travel back to 1928, to a hospital in the Argentine city of Rosario, where a baby is born who will grow up to shake the world. This is the bedtime biography of Che Guevara.
The attack came without warning, as it always did. 2-year-old Ernesto was swimming with his mother in the chilly waters of a country club pool when his lungs suddenly seized. The gasping, the wheezing, the desperate fight for air, these would become the soundtrack of his childhood. The diagnosis was severe chronic asthma, and in 1930 there was little medicine could do except manage the symptoms and hope the child survived. Ernesto Guevara de la Serna had been born on June 14, 1928 in Rosario, Argentina, though his parents would later falsify the birth certificate to read May 14th, a bureaucratic deception to conceal that his mother, Celia de la Serna, had been pregnant before marriage. This small dishonesty was characteristic of the Guevara Lynch family, respectable enough to care about appearances, unconventional enough to bend the rules. The family moved constantly during Ernesto's early years, chasing climates that might ease his breathing. They settled eventually in Alta Gracia, a small city in the hills of Córdoba province, where the dry mountain air offered some relief. Here, in a modest house that always seemed to be falling apart, young Ernesto would spend his formative years. His parents were bohemians of a particular Argentine type. Ernesto Guevara Lynch, the father, was a failed businessman with aristocratic pretensions and leftist sympathies, a man who would try his hand at yerba mate cultivation, construction, real estate, and various other ventures, succeeding at none of them. Celia, the mother, was the more formidable personality, fiercely intelligent, politically progressive, and utterly devoted to her firstborn son. She taught him to read before he started school. She introduced him to poetry and politics. She would remain the most important woman in his life until her death. The household was chaotic, intellectual, and remarkably permissive. Books piled everywhere. Political refugees from the Spanish Civil War passed through, filling the young boy's head with stories of fascism and resistance. The children ran half wild, and Ernesto, despite his illness, or perhaps because of it, pushed himself harder than any of them. The asthma shaped everything. Attacks could last for days, leaving him bedridden, fighting for each breath. His mother would sit beside him through the worst nights, helping him find positions that eased the constriction, reading to him when he was too weak to hold a book himself. The disease taught him early what it meant to struggle against his own body, to refuse surrender, to endure. It also made him reckless. Between attacks, Ernesto threw himself into physical activity with an intensity that alarmed his doctors and delighted his peers. He played rugby with abandon despite his wheezing lungs. He climbed trees and swam rivers and picked fights with bigger boys. He seemed determined to prove that his body would not limit him, or perhaps to punish it for its betrayals. His classmates remembered him as fearless to the point of foolishness. He would take any dare, accept any challenge. When other children hung back, Ernesto charged forward. This was not mere bravado. It was something deeper, a fundamental refusal to accept limitations, a conviction that willpower could overcome any obstacle. This belief would carry him through jungles and battlefields. It would also lead him to his death. The intellectual development ran parallel to the physical defiance. Ernesto devoured books with the same intensity he brought to rugby. He read voraciously and indiscriminately, adventure novels, poetry, philosophy, psychology. By his teens, he was working through Freud and Marx, Neruda and Baudelaire. He kept notebooks filled with quotations and reflections, the beginnings of a lifelong habit of intellectual self-documentation. His parents' politics seeped into him gradually. The Spanish refugees who stayed in their home told stories of the Republic's defeat, of Franco's brutality, of international solidarity betrayed. The family supported the Allied cause during World War II, at a time when many Argentine elites flirted with fascism. Young Ernesto absorbed the assumption that politics mattered, that history was not something that happened to other people, that one had a duty to engage with the world's struggles.
But he was not yet a revolutionary. The teenage Ernesto was a romantic, a bookworm, a young man of considerable privilege despite his family's financial instability. He had servants and country clubs and the assumption that university awaited. His rebellion, such as it was, expressed itself in slovenly dress and deliberate provocation. He delighted in shocking bourgeois sensibilities, in saying outrageous things at dinner parties, in refusing the conventions his class expected. He had girlfriends, wrote poetry, played chess obsessively. He developed a reputation for personal hygiene so poor that friends nicknamed him El Chancho, the pig. He seemed to take pride in his own grubbiness, as if cleanliness were a bourgeois affectation beneath his concern. This too would persist. The revolutionary Che would be famous for his indifference to bathing, his rumpled uniforms, his scorn for material comfort. In 1947, the family moved to Buenos Aires, where Ernesto enrolled in medical school. The choice of medicine reflected both his mother's influence, she hoped he might find a cure for his own condition, and a genuine interest in human suffering. He was a capable, if undistinguished, student, more interested in his independent reading than in his coursework. Buenos Aires in the late 1940s was a city of political ferment. Juan Perón had risen to power, mobilizing the working class in ways that divided Argentine society. The young Guevara observed but did not participate. He remained aloof from student politics, more interested in his books and his adventures than in organizing or activism. The revolutionary was still dormant, waiting for something to awaken him. That awakening would come on the road. In 1950, Ernesto attached a small motor to his bicycle and set off alone across northern Argentina. He visited leper colonies and indigenous communities, seeing for the first time the poverty that existed beyond his comfortable world. But this was mere prelude. The real transformation awaited 2 years later, when he and a friend would embark on a journey that would change everything. The journey that would become the Motorcycle Diaries began on a January morning in 1952. Ernesto was 23 years old, a medical student with a few exams left to complete his degree. His companion was Alberto Granado, a biochemist 7 years his senior, with whom he shared a love of adventure and a battered Norton 500 motorcycle they called La Poderosa, the Mighty One. Their plan was audacious, to travel the length of South America, from Buenos Aires to Venezuela, across mountains and deserts and jungles, through countries they had only read about. They had almost no money. Their motorcycle was held together with wire and hope. They carried medical bags, planning to work in hospitals along the way. The journey was meant to last 4 months. It would last 8.
La Poderosa died in Chile, defeated by the Andes and its own mechanical fragility. After that, they traveled by hitchhiking, by foot, by raft, by whatever means presented itself. They worked as doctors, as dishwashers, as laborers. They slept in police stations and barns and under the stars. They were hungry often and cold frequently, and happy most of the time. But something was changing in Ernesto as the miles accumulated. He was seeing South America as he had never seen it before, not as a tourist, not as a privileged medical student, but as the continent's poor saw it. In Chile, he met miners working in conditions that would have been illegal in any developed country, their lungs filling with dust that would kill them before they reached middle age. In Peru, he saw indigenous people living in poverty unchanged since the Spanish conquest, their land stolen, their culture suppressed, their humanity denied. The leper colony at San Pablo, on the banks of the Amazon, marked a turning point. Ernesto and Alberto spent 3 weeks there, working alongside the patients, refusing to wear gloves, treating the lepers as human beings rather than untouchables. On Ernesto's 24th birthday, he swam across the Amazon to join the patients on their side of the river, a gesture of solidarity that moved them to tears. In his diary, Ernesto wrote about a continent divided between those who had and those who had not, between the exploiters and the exploited. He wrote about the unity of Latin America, about the arbitrary borders drawn by colonial powers, about the common heritage and common suffering that bound the people together. He was not yet a Marxist, not yet a revolutionary, but the seeds were planted. The journey ended in Venezuela in July 1952. Alberto stayed to work in a leper colony there. Ernesto flew home to complete his medical degree, his only flight of the entire trip, paid for by an uncle. He returned to Buenos Aires a different person than the one who had left. The comfortable assumptions of his class had been shattered. The poverty he had witnessed demanded a response. He finished his degree in record time, driven now by a new urgency, but he had no intention of settling into a conventional medical practice. Within months of graduation, he was on the road again, this time heading north, toward the center of the hemisphere's political earthquake. Guatemala in 1954 was an experiment in democratic reform. President Jacobo Arbenz had been elected on a platform of land reform and social justice. He was redistributing unused land from the United Fruit Company to peasant farmers. He was building schools and hospitals. He was trying to create a more equal society through legal, democratic means. This was intolerable to the United States. The CIA was already planning a coup. Ernesto arrived in Guatemala City in early 1954, just as the crisis was building. He had no money and no prospects, but he was exactly where history was happening. He found work in various medical positions while immersing himself in the political ferment. He met exiles from across Latin America, Cubans, Peruvians, Venezuelans, all drawn to Guatemala's experiment, all watching to see if reform could succeed. He also met Hilda Gadea, a Peruvian economist and political activist who would become his first wife. She introduced him to Marxist theory, gave him books he had not read, challenged him to systematize his political thinking. Their relationship was intellectual as much as romantic, a partnership of ideas that would produce a daughter, Hildita, born in 1956.
When the CIA's coup finally came in June 1954, Ernesto tried to organize resistance. He volunteered to fight, to distribute weapons, to do anything, but the Arbenz government collapsed in days, betrayed by its own military, abandoned by any hope of outside support. Ernesto watched as the reform experiment was crushed, as leftists were rounded up and killed, as the United States installed a military dictatorship that would murder hundreds of thousands over the following decades. The lesson was burned into his consciousness. Reform was not enough. Democracy was not enough. The United States would not permit fundamental change in Latin America. Revolution, armed, uncompromising, total, was the only answer. He fled Guatemala for Mexico, a wanted man, his name on the lists that the CIA had provided to the new regime. Behind him, Guatemala descended into decades of military rule, genocide, and civil war. Ahead lay Mexico City, where a group of Cuban exiles were planning an improbable invasion, and a man named Fidel Castro was looking for a doctor. As you settle into the quiet of this evening, consider the young man at the end of that Guatemalan chapter. He was 26 years old. He had traveled thousands of miles on motorcycles and trucks and rafts. He had seen the breadth of Latin American poverty. He had watched a democratic government destroyed by foreign intervention. He had read Marx and practiced medicine and fallen in love. He was not yet Che. That name would come later, a Cuban way of saying, "Hey you," that became an identity. He was still Ernesto Guevara, an Argentine doctor in exile, angry and radicalized and looking for a way to fight back. The revolution that would make him famous was still 2 years away. The photograph that would make him immortal was still 13 years away too. But the transformation was almost complete. The asthmatic boy from Alta Gracia had become something else, a man willing to kill and die for his beliefs, a man convinced that violence was necessary for justice, a man who would inspire millions and terrify millions more. In our next chapter, we will follow him to Mexico City, where a fateful meeting with Fidel Castro would set both their lives on an irreversible course. The grandma would sail for Cuba, the revolution would triumph, and the legend of Che would begin. For now, rest with the image of that young doctor standing in the ruins of Guatemala's hopes, vowing that next time would be different. Next time the revolution would fight back. Next time the revolution would win. Sleep well. Tomorrow we sail for Cuba.
Mexico City, July 1955. A cramped apartment in a working-class neighborhood. Ernesto Guevara sits across from a tall, charismatic Cuban with a wild black beard and boundless confidence. Fidel Castro talks for hours. He always talks for hours about Cuba under the dictator Batista, about corruption and repression, about the failed attack on the Moncada barracks that landed him in prison, about his certainty that the Cuban people are ready for revolution. Ernesto listens, occasionally asking questions. When Fidel finally pauses for breath, the Argentine doctor says simply, "I'm in." The meeting lasted all night. By morning, Ernesto had committed himself to an invasion of Cuba by a ragtag group of exiles who had no boat, almost no weapons, and a plan that seemed suicidal even to its own participants. His medical career, already abandoned in practice if not in name, was now officially over. He had found his calling. The Cuban exiles took to calling him Che, the Argentine interjection, roughly equivalent to "hey" or "man," that peppered his speech. At first, it was affectionate mockery of his foreignness. Soon, it became simply his name. Ernesto Guevara was fading. Che was being born. The training began in earnest. Fidel had gathered about 80 men in Mexico, mostly Cuban exiles, but a few foreigners drawn by ideology or adventure. They drilled in secret camps outside the city, preparing for guerrilla warfare. Most had never fired a gun. Che, with his asthma and his bookishness, seemed among the least promising fighters. But something emerged during the training that surprised everyone, including Che himself. He was tireless. When others collapsed from exhaustion, he pushed harder. When the drills became unbearable, he volunteered for more. His lungs wheezed and protested, but his will was absolute. Alberto Bayo, the Spanish Republican veteran who trained them, noticed this quality. He marked Che as one of the few who might actually survive what was coming. The Mexican police arrested them all in June 1956. Someone had informed on the group. The authorities raided the training camp and hauled the revolutionaries to prison. Most were released after negotiations and bribes, but Che, the foreigner, faced deportation. Fidel refused to leave without him, using his considerable powers of persuasion and substantial bribes from supporters to secure Che's release. The delay cost them months. When they finally secured a boat, an ancient, leaking yacht named the Grandma, they were racing against time. Mexican authorities were closing in. Cuban police had infiltrated the group. They needed to leave immediately or not at all.
The Grandma was built to carry 12 passengers. They crammed 82 men aboard, along with weapons, ammunition, and supplies. The boat sat so low in the water that waves washed over the deck. The voyage from Mexico to Cuba, which should have taken 5 days, took 7. Men were seasick from the moment they left port. The motor failed repeatedly. Water leaked through the hull. They had to bail constantly just to stay afloat. Che was as seasick as anyone. He spent much of the voyage hanging over the rail, vomiting into the Caribbean while clutching his asthma inhaler. This was the romantic revolutionary, doubled over, gasping, covered in his own vomit, on a boat that might sink at any moment, heading toward an invasion that had almost no chance of success. They landed on December 2nd, 1956, not at the designated beach but in a mangrove swamp. The Grandma ran aground. Men jumped into chest-deep water and struggled ashore, losing weapons and supplies. They were supposed to coordinate with an urban uprising in Santiago. Instead, they were late, lost, and walking straight into an ambush. Batista's forces were waiting. 3 days after landing, the rebels were caught in the open at a place called Alegría de Pio. Planes strafed them, soldiers surrounded them. Of the 82 men who had landed, most were killed or captured in the first week. The survivors scattered into the Sierra Maestra Mountains in small groups, hoping to regroup. Che faced his moment of truth in that ambush. He was hit in the neck and chest, not by bullets, but by fragments that knocked him down. Bleeding, disoriented, he saw a box of ammunition nearby and a medical kit. He could carry one or the other, not both. For an instant, he hesitated. The doctor or the revolutionary, the healer or the fighter. He grabbed the ammunition. That choice made in seconds under fire to find everything that followed. Che the doctor had served his last patient. Che the guerrilla was born. In the mountains, the survivors found each other slowly. Fidel, Che, Raul Castro, Fidel's younger brother, Camilo Cienfuegos, and a handful of others. They had almost no weapons, no food, no contact with the outside world. Local peasants helped them, providing shelter and intelligence about army movements. Without peasant support, they would have died in the first month. The guerrilla war that followed lasted 25 months. It began with perhaps a dozen effective fighters. It would end with Batista fleeing the country on New Year's Day, 1959, abandoning power to the rebels he could not defeat. The war transformed Che. The asthmatic intellectual became one of the revolution's most effective commanders. He led from the front, volunteered for the most dangerous assignments, and drove his men with a ferocity that bordered on cruelty. Stragglers were berated, cowards were shamed, deserters were sometimes executed. Che believed absolutely in discipline and sacrifice and the necessity of hardness in pursuit of the cause. He also established himself as the revolution's intellectual. While other commanders focused purely on military matters, Che read and wrote constantly. He published a newsletter for the guerrillas. He taught literacy classes to peasant recruits. He read philosophy by candlelight in mountain camps. He was creating, even then, a theory of guerrilla warfare that would influence revolutionaries worldwide.
The strategy was simple in concept, brutally difficult in execution. Small mobile units would harass the army, then disappear into the mountains before superior forces could respond. They would win peasant support through land reform and respect, treating the rural poor as human beings rather than as obstacles or animals. They would gradually expand the territory they controlled, creating liberated zones where revolutionary justice replaced Batista's corruption. Che's column was given the hardest assignments. When a position needed to be taken, Che's men went first. When supplies were shortest, Che's column made do with less. His men hated and loved him in equal measure, hated the relentless demands, loved the absolute courage and the certainty that Che would never ask them to do what he would not do himself. He was wounded several times. Bullets grazed him, shrapnel caught him. His asthma attacked at the worst moments, leaving him gasping in the middle of firefights. He carried an inhaler and ammunition with equal devotion, using both when the fighting got close. The war also revealed Che's capacity for ruthlessness. When the revolution captured enemy soldiers, Che argued for harsh treatment. Informers were executed. Traitors were shot. Batista's men who committed atrocities were killed without trial. Che's column developed a reputation for swift, brutal justice. He did not flinch from this. Justice, he believed, required harshness. The revolution could not afford mercy toward its enemies. But he also won loyalty through example. Che shared every hardship. When there was no food, he starved with his men. When there was one meal, he ensured the wounded ate first. When supplies of medicine ran short, he treated the sickest first, saving nothing for himself despite his asthma. His men saw this. They understood that Che's harshness was directed equally at himself. The turning point came in late 1958. Batista's army, demoralized and corrupt, began to crumble. Che led a column across central Cuba, capturing towns and cutting the island in two. The Battle of Santa Clara in December 1958 was his masterpiece. With a few hundred guerrillas, he defeated a garrison of thousands, derailing an armored train and taking the city in fierce fighting.
After La Cabana came a series of government positions. Che was made president of the National Bank, an absurd appointment given his complete lack of financial training, later explained by the possibly apocryphal story that when Fidel asked who was an economist, Che thought he said comunista, communist, and raised his hand. He signed Cuban currency with his nickname, Che, treating the whole thing as a kind of joke. But there was nothing joking about his efforts to transform Cuba's economy. As Minister of Industries from 1961 onward, Che tried to implement his vision of socialist development. He believed in moral incentives rather than material ones, that workers would labor harder for the revolution than for personal gain. He cut his own salary to the level of an ordinary worker. He spent his weekends doing voluntary labor in fields and factories, setting an example he hoped others would follow. He also oversaw Cuba's growing relationship with the Soviet Union. This was pragmatic necessity. After the U.S. imposed its embargo, Cuba needed a sponsor, and the Soviets were willing. But Che was never comfortable with Soviet-style communism. He thought the Soviets had betrayed the revolution, had become bureaucratic and conservative, had settled her peaceful coexistence with capitalism rather than fighting for global revolution. These tensions would grow, but in the early 1960s, Che was busy building Cuba's new order, working 18-hour days, driving himself and everyone around him to exhaustion in service of the revolution. He was at the height of his power and influence. He was also becoming restless, because Che was, at his core, a revolutionary, not an administrator. He had fought his way to power. Holding power bored him. The paperwork, the meetings, the compromises necessary to actually govern, these suffocated him. He began to dream of new fronts, new battles, new revolutions to ignite. Cuba was one. Where next? As sleep approaches, consider the transformation we have traced. The asthmatic boy became a doctor. The doctor became a guerrilla. The guerrilla became a commander. The commander became a government minister. At each stage, something was added and something was lost.
What remained constant was the conviction, the absolute certainty that revolution was necessary, that sacrifice was required, that violence in pursuit of justice was noble. Che never doubted the righteousness of his cause. This made him effective. It also made him dangerous. In our next chapter, we will see Che at the summit of his influence, negotiating with the Soviets, confronting the U.S. during the Cuban Missile Crisis, spreading the gospel of revolution across the developing world. We will also see the beginning of his disillusionment with power and his growing desire to leave Cuba behind in search of new struggles. The restless revolutionary cannot rest. Victory is only the beginning. For Che, there was always another battle, another oppression to fight, another injustice demanding response. This conviction would take him to Africa, then to Bolivia. It would make him a legend, and it would kill him. But that comes later. Tonight, let him rest in this moment of triumph, bearded and young and alive, riding into Havana on a wave of hope, believing absolutely that a better world was possible and that he was helping to build it. Tomorrow, the complications. Tonight, the dream. Sleep well. The revolution continues.
The work began at dawn and ended long after midnight. Che, in his office at the Ministry of Industries, surrounded by reports he barely had time to read, signing documents, making decisions about things he only half understood. The guerrilla commander who had lived on rice and beans in the mountains now presided over sugar quotas and industrial production targets. He hated almost every minute of it. But he drove himself relentlessly because this was what the revolution needed. If Cuba was to survive the American embargo, it needed an economy that functioned. If socialism was to prove itself superior to capitalism, it needed to produce results. And Che believed, perhaps longer than he should have, that moral incentives could replace material ones, that workers would sacrifice for the common good, that a new kind of human being could be forged in the crucible of revolution. He called this the new man, el hombre nuevo, a person motivated not by greed or personal ambition, but by collective consciousness and revolutionary duty. Someone who worked not for a paycheck, but for the satisfaction of building a just society. Che genuinely believed such people could exist. He tried to make himself the first example. Every Sunday, Che joined voluntary labor brigades. He cut sugarcane in the fields alongside workers, his asthma wheezing, his hands blistering, pushing himself until he collapsed. It was not a publicity stunt, though it was photographed. It was Che trying to embody his own philosophy that leaders must serve, that no one was above labor, that the revolution demanded sacrifice from everyone, starting with those at the top. His colleagues found this admirable and exhausting. Che expected everyone to match his intensity. He arrived at meetings early and left late. He read economic reports through the night. He demanded the impossible and grew frustrated when reality failed to bend to revolutionary will. He was, in short, a terrible administrator, too idealistic, too impatient, too convinced that moral clarity could overcome practical obstacles. But there were moments when Che's unique qualities made him indispensable. The Cuban Missile Crisis of October 1962 was one of them. The crisis began with American spy planes detecting Soviet missile installations in Cuba. Kennedy demanded their removal. Khrushchev refused. For 13 days, the world balanced on the edge of nuclear war. American warships blockaded Cuba. Soviet submarines armed with nuclear torpedoes prowled the Caribbean. Both sides prepared for the possibility that this might be the moment when the Cold War turned hot. Che's position throughout was uncompromising. If the missiles could strike the United States and defend Cuba from invasion, they should be used. When Khrushchev blinked, agreeing to remove the missiles in exchange for American promises not to invade Cuba, Che was furious. He saw it as betrayal, as the Soviets sacrificing Cuba's security for their own accommodation with imperialism. Years later, in a chilling interview, Che was asked what he would have done if he had controlled the missiles during the crisis. "We would have used them," he said. The interviewer clarified, "Even knowing it would lead to nuclear war?" "Yes," Che answered. "Better to die fighting than to live under domination."
Better to risk annihilation than to accept injustice. This was Che's revolutionary purity taken to its logical extreme. The cause mattered more than survival. Principle trumped pragmatism. He was willing to die for the revolution and willing to take millions with him. It was the same absolute conviction that made him effective in the mountains and dangerous in positions of power. The missile crisis deepened Che's disillusionment with the Soviet Union. The Soviets, he concluded, had stopped being revolutionary. They had become just another imperial power, using Cuba as a pawn in their game with the Americans. They preached socialist solidarity but practiced realpolitik. They talked about supporting liberation movements but pulled back whenever confrontation got serious. Che began to look elsewhere. If Cuba was won and the Soviets had betrayed the cause, where could revolution still be kindled? The answer, he believed, was the Third World, the colonized and recently decolonized nations of Africa, Asia, and Latin America. These were the places where imperialism was most vulnerable, where revolutionary consciousness could be awakened, where guerrilla warfare might succeed. In 1964 and 1965, Che traveled extensively, speaking at the United Nations, meeting with revolutionary movements, searching for the next front. At the UN in December 1964, he gave a blistering speech condemning American imperialism, Soviet revisionism, and the entire structure of global inequality. He denounced the murder of Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba, named the United States as responsible for untold suffering across the developing world, and called for multiple Vietnams, many simultaneous revolutionary wars that would stretch imperialism to the breaking point. The speech was vintage Che, uncompromising, moralistic, uninterested in diplomacy or nuance. It made headlines worldwide. It also made clear that Che had no future in conventional politics. He was a revolutionary, not a statesman. He belonged in the field, not behind a desk. His marriage to Hilda had ended quietly years before. He had married again to Aleida March, a fellow revolutionary he'd met during the guerrilla war. They had 4 children together, whom Che loved in his distant, distracted way, but he was never truly present. His mind was always elsewhere, planning the next campaign, dreaming of other fronts.
In early 1965, Che disappeared from public view. Speculation swirled. Was he dead? Had he broken with Fidel? Had he been purged? The truth was simpler and more extraordinary. Che had left Cuba to fight in the Congo. The Congo in 1965 was chaos. Patrice Lumumba, the democratically elected prime minister, had been murdered in 1961 with CIA complicity. The country was fragmenting into fiefdoms controlled by warlords and foreign mining interests. A leftist rebellion had broken out in the east, and Che believed it could become the spark that ignited African revolution. He arrived with about 100 Cuban fighters in April 1965, traveling in secret via Tanzania. He shaved his head, changed his appearance, used false documents. In the Congolese mountains, he planned to replicate the Sierra Maestra, building a guerrilla army, winning peasant support, creating a revolutionary base from which liberation could spread. It was a disaster from the start. The Congolese rebels were not the Cuban peasants Che had known. They believed in dawa, magic that would make them bulletproof. They refused discipline. They drank heavily and raped local women. When Che tried to impose order, they ignored him. When he insisted on training and planning, they wanted only weapons and loot. The Cuban advisors were foreigners who did not speak the language, did not understand the culture, and could not win the locals' trust. Che's asthma, always present, became debilitating in the Congo's humid climate. He was sick constantly, weakened by dysentery and fever, unable to lead as he once had. His diary from the Congo period makes painful reading, a proud man confronting total failure, watching his theories collapse against reality, unable to admit that the problem might be the theories themselves. The Congolese rebellion was crushed by late 1965. Che and the Cubans evacuated, having achieved nothing. He had spent 7 months in the Congo. He had not fired a shot in anger. The experience should have taught him that revolution could not be exported, that local conditions mattered, that will and courage were not enough without popular support and political understanding. Instead, Che drew different lessons. The Congo failed because the leadership was corrupt, because the fighters were undisciplined, because the revolution was not pure enough. Next time would be different. Next time he would choose more carefully. Next time he would succeed. He could not return to Cuba, at least not permanently. To come back as a minister, to resume the bureaucratic drudgery, would be to admit that the revolutionary moment had passed, that his future was administration rather than action. Che could not accept this. He was 37 years old. He still believed he could change the world. He spent months in Cuba, hidden away, writing his Congo memoir and planning his next move. He said goodbye to his children, though they did not understand it was goodbye. His youngest daughter, born while he was in the Congo, he barely knew at all. Aleida understood what was happening. Her husband was leaving again, perhaps forever this time. But she also understood that Che could not be held. The revolution demanded everything. In October 1966, Che left Cuba for the last time. His destination was Bolivia. His mission was to ignite revolutionary war in the heart of South America, to create the FOCO, the guerrilla center from which liberation would spread across the continent. He believed Bolivia was ideal: indigenous majority, brutal inequality, weak government, and borders with 5 other countries. A successful revolution there could spread like wildfire.
Before leaving, Che wrote farewell letters. To his parents, he wrote with unusual tenderness, acknowledging the pain his choices caused them. To his children, he wrote hoping they would understand someday why he had chosen the struggle over them. To Fidel, he wrote renouncing all his positions in Cuban citizenship, severing formal ties so Cuba could deny involvement when things went wrong. That last letter was read publicly by Fidel in October 1965, before Che even left for Bolivia. It created the impression that Che had already gone, that he was out there somewhere, fighting, spreading revolution. The myth was being created even while the man prepared for his final campaign. The letters reveal something poignant. Che knew this might be the end. He knew the odds were against him. He went anyway, driven by conviction that transcended self-preservation. He believed that revolution was the highest calling, that his life mattered only insofar as it served the cause, that dying for liberation was more meaningful than living comfortably. This was Che's strange nobility and his terrible blindness. He was willing to sacrifice everything, including the people who loved him, for a vision of justice. He was also willing to sacrifice others, to order executions and launch wars and create suffering in pursuit of that vision. The romantic and the fanatic coexisted in him, impossible to separate. As the 1960s wore on, Che became increasingly isolated ideologically. The Soviets considered him a dangerous romantic. The Chinese communists were fighting their own battles. Most Latin American communist parties opposed his guerrilla strategy, preferring to work through legal channels. Even Fidel, while publicly supporting Che, privately doubted that the Bolivian campaign could succeed. But Che could not stop. To stop was to accept that the revolution had limits, that not all oppression could be ended by armed struggle, that sometimes the world refused to conform to theory. He could not accept this. So he continued, driven by the same conviction that had carried him through the Sierra Maestra, now leading him toward the Bolivian mountains and his final rendezvous with history. As you settle toward sleep, hold this image: Che in his final weeks in Cuba, saying goodbye to a life he could have had: comfort, family, influence, the gratitude of a nation he helped liberate, all of it available to him. All of it insufficient, because Che had defined himself as a revolutionary, and revolutionaries do not retire. They fight until they win or die. There is no third option, no peaceful old age, no contentment with partial victories. The revolutionary is always moving toward the next battle, always searching for the next oppression to destroy. This makes for a compelling story. It makes for a tragic life. Che was about to discover which mattered more. In our next chapter, we follow him into the Bolivian wilderness, the final campaign, the dwindling band of guerrillas, the peasants who did not rise as theory said they would, the Bolivian army closing in. We watch as the revolutionary confronts the gap between his vision and reality, between his will and the world's refusal to bend. It will not end well, but it will end in a way that ensures the story never ends, a death that transforms a man into a symbol, a failure that becomes an inspiration, a life that loses its complexity and gains an afterlife in the imaginations of millions. But that comes tomorrow. Tonight, let Che rest before the final journey. Let him be, for one more night, a man rather than a myth. Let him hold his children, knowing he will leave them. Let him be human, flawed, and still hopeful that the next revolution will be the one that succeeds. Sleep now. The mountains wait. The end approaches. The legend is about to be born.
He called himself Ramon. The disguise was elaborate: balding wig, thick glasses, gray dye in his remaining hair, dental work to change the shape of his mouth. He entered Bolivia in November 1966, looking like a middle-aged businessman, nothing like the iconic bearded revolutionary whose face had appeared on magazine covers worldwide. The farm they purchased was remote, Nyankawasu in the southeastern mountains, hours from the nearest town. The plan was familiar: establish a base, recruit fighters, train them in guerrilla tactics, win peasant support, then spread the revolution outward. It had worked in Cuba. Che believed it would work anywhere the conditions of oppression existed. Bolivia had those conditions in abundance. But Bolivia was not Cuba, and 1967 was not 1956. The Bolivian Communist Party, which Che had expected to support him, instead opposed the guerrilla campaign. They believed in working through legal channels, in building mass movements rather than launching armed struggle. Mario Monge, the party's leader, met with Che in December and demanded political control of any guerrilla operation. Che refused. He would accept tactical advice, but not strategic direction. Monge left, taking with him any hope of urban support or political infrastructure. This was the first crack in the foundation. The Cuban Revolution had succeeded partly because the urban underground coordinated with the rural guerrillas, because Fidel had political alliances and propaganda networks, because the movement was embedded in Cuban society rather than imposed from outside. In Bolivia, Che was isolated from the start. Foreign fighters trying to spark a revolution among people who had not asked for it. The guerrilla band at its peak numbered only about 50 fighters. Some were Cubans who had followed Che into exile. Some were Bolivian communists who defied their party's orders. A few were idealistic foreigners drawn by Che's reputation. They were brave, committed, and hopelessly outnumbered. The training period was cut short by accidents and betrayals. In February 1967, 2 fighters deserted and informed the authorities. The Bolivian army now knew guerrillas were operating in the area. The element of surprise was lost. The army began sending patrols into the region, forcing Che to move before his force was ready. What followed was 7 months of slow-motion disaster. The guerrillas moved through the mountains, trying to avoid the army while making contact with peasants. But the peasants did not rally to their cause. Bolivia had undergone land reform in 1952, imperfect, incomplete, but enough to give many peasants small plots of their own. They were not starving, landless laborers desperate for revolution. They were subsistence farmers who wanted to be left alone, not recruited into someone else's war. Worse, the guerrillas were foreigners. Their Spanish had Cuban and Argentine accents. They did not understand Quechua or Aymara, the indigenous languages spoken by most rural Bolivians. When they tried to explain Marxism and liberation, the peasants nodded politely and reported their positions to the army. The cultural and linguistic barriers that Che had dismissed as minor details proved insurmountable. The terrain was brutal. Dense jungle alternating with barren highlands, rivers swollen with seasonal rains, mountains that left even the fittest fighters gasping. Che's phasma, managed in Cuba with regular medication, became a constant torment. His inhaler ran out. He resorted to cigarettes, hoping the nicotine would open his airways. It only made things worse. There were days when he could barely walk, when his breathing was so labored that the others wondered if he would die from his own lungs before the army could catch him.
The guerrillas were constantly hungry. They ran out of food and had to slaughter their horses. Then they ran out of horses and ate whatever they could forage. Some men developed edema from malnutrition. Others suffered from dysentery. All were exhausted. The romantic image of guerrilla warfare, brave fighters sustained by ideology and popular support, gave way to the reality. Starving men stumbling through hostile terrain, hunted by an army that grew stronger while they grew weaker. The split came in April. Che divided the force, sending one group under Joaquin to make contact with urban supporters while he continued with the main column. They agreed to reunite in 5 days. It never happened. The two groups lost contact with each other and spent months searching, unable to coordinate, each thinking the other destroyed. The Bolivian army, meanwhile, was learning. With CIA assistance, they established a counterinsurgency base and brought in American Special Forces advisors to train elite ranger units. These were not the corrupt, demoralized soldiers Batista had commanded. These were young, fit fighters trained specifically to hunt guerrillas in mountain terrain. They knew the land. They spoke the languages. They could match the guerrillas in endurance and exceed them in numbers. The noose tightened slowly. In August, Joaquin's group was ambushed crossing a river. Joaquin was killed along with nearly all his fighters. The army now had prisoners who could be interrogated, documents that revealed the guerrillas' plans, and proof that the famous Che Guevara was leading the operation. His identity had been kept secret until documents confirmed it. Che received no news of this disaster. His radio had broken. He could not communicate with Havana or learn what was happening elsewhere in Bolivia. He was operating blind, making decisions without information, hoping his missing comrades were alive while they were already dead and buried. September brought more losses. The guerrilla band was down to 17 fighters. They were cornered in a region called Alto Seco, high and dry, a fitting name for their desperate situation. Food was almost gone. Medicine was exhausted. Che could barely breathe without pain. His feet were swollen and infected. He wrote in his diary that the situation was becoming precarious. The peasants in the area reported every movement to the army. The guerrillas tried to buy food and were refused. They tried to commandeer supplies and turned the population further against them. They were revolutionaries fighting for the people, but the people wanted nothing to do with them. The gap between theory and reality had become unbridgeable. Still, Che pushed on. On October 7th, the guerrillas camped in a ravine near the village of La Higuera. Che's diary entry for that day is brief. The 11-month anniversary of our guerrilla inauguration passed in a bucolic mood. Even in extremity, he maintained the ironic detachment that had characterized his writing since youth. He noted that a peasant woman tending goats had spotted them. He noted that the area seemed inhospitable. He did not know these would be his final written words. The Bolivian army surrounded the ravine during the night. At dawn on October 8th, the shooting began. The guerrillas tried to fight their way out. Some succeeded, escaping into the hills. Most were killed or captured. Che, weakened by asthma and unable to run, was hit in the leg. His M2 carbine was shot from his hands, the strap breaking. He was effectively disarmed. The soldiers captured him alive. They did not recognize him at first. The balding, bearded, filthy man before them looked nothing like the photographs they had been shown. But his accent gave him away, and the bearing, the way he commanded attention even as a prisoner. One of the officers realized who they had caught.
They radioed their superiors. They had Che Guevara. He was taken to La Higuera, a tiny village with a one-room schoolhouse. There he spent his final night, lying on the dirt floor, hands bound, guarded by soldiers who could not quite believe they had captured the legendary revolutionary. Some wanted to kill him immediately. Others wanted to take him alive to La Paz for trial and interrogation. They radioed for instructions and waited. Che knew what was coming. When a young schoolteacher approached, curious to see the famous guerrilla, Che told her that the government would kill him. He spoke calmly, without bitterness, as if discussing someone else's fate. He had always known it would probably end this way. He had written as much in his farewell letters. Death in combat was preferable to death in old age. To die fighting for liberation was the highest purpose he could imagine. The soldiers guarding him were young conscripts, mostly indigenous Bolivians. Che tried to talk with them, telling them they were poor like him, that they should be fighting for revolution rather than defending the rich. They listened uncomfortably, unsure what to make of this foreigner who claimed to fight for them, but whom they had been ordered to hunt. The orders came from the highest levels. President Barrientos, after consulting with the CIA, decided Che should be executed. Trying him would create a spectacle, a platform for his ideas. Keeping him imprisoned risked rescue attempts and turned him into a cause célèbre. Better to kill him quickly and deny the myth any oxygen. The officer tasked with the execution was Sergeant Mario Terán. He drew the assignment by lottery. None of the other soldiers wanted to be the one to kill Che Guevara. Terán was given specific instructions. Do not shoot Che in the head or heart. The death had to look like it occurred during combat, not execution. Shoot him in the body, below the neck, and let him bleed out. Terán entered the schoolhouse, drunk. He had needed alcohol to build courage. Che, lying on the floor, looked up at him and said, "I know you've come to kill me. Shoot, coward. You are only going to kill a man." Different witnesses remembered the words differently, but all agreed on the tone. Contempt mixed with acceptance. A man facing death without begging or breaking. Terán raised his rifle. His hands were shaking. He fired into Che's legs and torso, multiple shots, following orders to avoid immediately fatal wounds. Che did not scream. He writhed in pain, bleeding from multiple wounds, taking nearly 10 minutes to die. It was October 9th, 1967. He was 39 years old.
The body was displayed in the nearby town of Valle Grande. The army brought in journalists to photograph the corpse, proof that the legendary Che Guevara was really dead. They laid him out on a concrete laundry sink in the local hospital, his eyes half open, his hands displayed prominently. The fingerprints would be used for identification. The photographs went around the world. They showed a gaunt man, bearded, his torso marked with bullet wounds, his face strangely peaceful. Many noted the resemblance to images of Christ taken down from the cross. The comparison was inevitable and powerful, the revolutionary as martyr, sacrificed for the sins of an unjust world. The Bolivian authorities did not want a grave that could become a shrine. They severed Che's hands and sent them to Buenos Aires for fingerprint confirmation. Then they buried the body in a secret location near the Valle Grande airstrip, along with several of his guerrilla comrades. For 30 years, the burial site remained unknown, the subject of rumors and speculation. But hiding the body could not contain the legend. If anything, the secret of burial enhanced it. Che became a ghost haunting Latin America, his image appearing on walls from Mexico City to Buenos Aires, his name invoked by revolutionaries who had never met him, his writings studied by movements he would never see.
As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider the gap between the man and the myth. The man died in a Bolivian schoolhouse, wounded and alone. His evolution failed, his theories disproven, his life ending not in glory, but in squalor. The myth was born in the photographs of his corpse, in the CIA's fear that his ideas would outlive him, in the young people worldwide who saw in his face a reflection of their own revolutionary hopes. Which one was real? Both, perhaps, or neither. Che Guevara, the man, was complicated, brilliant and cruel, idealistic and ruthless, loving and absent, courageous and blind. Che Guevara, the myth, is whatever people need him to be: inspiration or warning, hero or villain, proof that revolution is possible or evidence that it cannot succeed. In our final chapter, we will trace what happened after his death, how the body was found, how the image became ubiquitous, how the revolutionary became a brand, how his legacy fractured into competing interpretations that would have baffled and perhaps horrified the man himself. But that is for tomorrow. Tonight, let Che rest. Let him be, for one final night, simply a man who believed in something larger than himself and died for it. Whatever else can be said about him, that much is true. He gave everything to his vision of justice. The tragedy is not that he died, but that so many died with him, and that the world he dreamed of building remained as distant after his death as before his birth. Sleep now. The schoolhouse in La Higuera is silent. The guerrilla is gone. Only the ghost remains, and ghosts belong to those who remember them. Tomorrow we will see how the remembering began and what it has made of the man who wanted to be remembered only as a revolutionary. Rest well. The final chapter awaits.
The photograph appeared everywhere within days of his death. Not the corpse on the laundry sink, though that image spread too, but the other one. The one Alberto Corda had taken 8 years earlier at the memorial service in Havana. Che looking into the distance, his face set in determination, his hair wild beneath the beret, his eyes focused on something beyond the frame. An Italian publisher found Corda's negative and printed it on a poster with the single word "heroic guerrilla." The poster swept across Europe in 1968, that year of global upheaval. Students marching in Paris carried Che's image. Protesters in Berlin held it high. The face that stared from walls and banners belonged to a dead man, but it had become shorthand for rebellion itself, young, defiant, unbowed. Corda never received a penny for the most reproduced photograph in history. Cuba had no copyright laws, and he had never registered the image internationally. When he learned that a vodka company was using Che's face to sell alcohol, he sued, not for money, but on principle. Che would have hated being used to sell liquor. Corda donated his settlement to Cuba's healthcare system. It was the only time he ever profited from the image that made him immortal. The irony was already visible by 1968. The anti-capitalist revolutionary's face was being mass-produced and sold by the very system he had fought to destroy. You could buy Che t-shirts from corporations paying sweatshop wages. You could get Che posters printed in factories where workers had no right to organize. The revolutionary who had rejected material incentives had become a commodity, his image generating profits that would have disgusted him. But the commodification came later. First came the mythology. For years after his death, rumors persisted that Che was still alive. The Bolivian government's secrecy about his burial fed the speculation. Sightings were reported from Chile to Colombia. Revolutionary movements claimed he was leading them. The CIA, which knew very well he was dead, nonetheless investigated reports of his survival. They could not afford to be wrong. Cuba declared 3 days of national mourning when his death was confirmed. Fidel gave a eulogy that lasted 2 hours, framing Che as a model revolutionary, a man of absolute integrity who had chosen to fight rather than enjoy the comfort of victory. If we wish to express what we want the men of future generations to be, we must say, "Let them be like Che," Fidel declared. The Cuban government built monuments. They named schools and hospitals after him. They turned October 9th into the day of the heroic guerrilla. But there was ambivalence too, though never stated publicly. Che had criticized the Soviet Union, Cuba's essential patron. His insistence on permanent revolution, on constantly exporting armed struggle, ran counter to Cuba's need for stability and Soviet support. His economic theories had failed. Moral incentives had not replaced material ones. Voluntary labor had not transformed production. The new man had not appeared. Fidel honored Che's memory while quietly abandoning his policies. The body remained missing until 1997. A Bolivian general, dying, revealed the location of the mass grave near Valle Grande. Cuban and Argentine forensic specialists excavated the site. They found skeletons, including one missing its hands. Dental records and DNA testing confirmed it was Che. The remains were returned to Cuba and reburied in Santa Clara, the city he had liberated in 1958, in a massive mausoleum built for the purpose. The ceremonies were elaborate. Fidel spoke again. Veterans of the Sierra Maestra wept. The Cuban government presented it as a hero's return, the revolutionary finally coming home. But Che had renounced his Cuban citizenship before leaving for Bolivia. He had wanted to die fighting, not to be enshrined in monuments. The man who rejected all formality and ceremony was given the most formal ceremony imaginable.
Meanwhile, the image proliferated beyond anyone's control. By the 1970s, Che's face appeared on everything from serious political posters to kitsch souvenirs. Leftist guerrillas in Latin America invoked his name while committing acts he might have condemned. Right-wing death squads killed people accused of being Cheists. Everyone claimed him or denounced him, but few engaged seriously with what he had actually written or believed. The writings themselves presented problems. Che's essays on guerrilla warfare inspired revolutionary movements worldwide, but most who tried to follow his strategy failed catastrophically. The Tupamaros in Uruguay, the Montoneros in Argentina, the FARC in Colombia, all cited Che, all believed armed struggle could spark revolution, all discovered that conditions in their countries did not match Bolivia or Cuba, and that repeating Che's tactics without understanding their limits was a path to death. His theoretical work was more sophisticated than his popular image suggested. Che read widely in economics and philosophy. His critiques of Soviet-style socialism were substantive. His vision of the new man, however utopian, came from genuine thought about how to create non-alienated labor. But nuance does not fit on t-shirts. The complex thinker was reduced to a simple symbol: revolution, rebellion, resistance. The 1968 generation adopted him as their icon. Students protesting the Vietnam War, feminists challenging patriarchy, workers demanding better conditions, all found something in Che's image. It did not matter that the historical Che had been a hardline Marxist-Leninist who would have had little sympathy for much of the New Left's agenda. The image was malleable. It could mean whatever people needed it to mean. By the 1990s, something remarkable had happened. Che's face had become divorced entirely from his ideology. You could buy Che merchandise while knowing nothing about Marxism or guerrilla warfare. The image signified only a vague rebelliousness, a generalized opposition to authority, a stylish edginess that required no actual commitment or risk. This would have horrified Che. He despised posturing and performative radicalism. He believed in sacrifice, discipline, total commitment. To wear his face on a t-shirt while shopping at the mall, to display his image while participating fully in consumer capitalism, this was precisely the kind of empty gesture he would have scorned. Yet there was something appropriate about it too. Che had believed that individual will and moral clarity could overcome material conditions. He had refused to accept that capitalism might be more resilient than revolutionary consciousness. His own commodification proved him wrong in the most ironic way possible. The market absorbed even his image, even his rejection of the market, turning rebellion itself into a product. His children lived complicated relationships with his legacy. Aleda, his daughter with Aleda March, became a revolutionary in her own right, fighting in Nicaragua with the Sandinistas. She carried on his commitment, for better or worse. His other children scattered, some embracing the legacy, others fleeing it, all marked by having a father who chose the revolution over them. The family was never whole. Che's Argentine children from his first marriage barely knew him. His Cuban children had memories of a distant father always preparing for the next campaign. They grew up in the shadow of a myth, expected to live up to a standard set by a man who had been absent from most of their lives. Some resented this, some embraced it. None escaped it. The debate about Che's legacy remains unresolved because the facts support competing interpretations. Was he a freedom fighter or a murderer? Both are true. He fought against genuine injustice and oppression. He also ordered executions and showed little remorse for the violence he authorized. Was he an idealist or a fanatic? Again, both. His vision of a more just world was genuine. His unwillingness to accept any limits on pursuing that vision made him dangerous. His defenders point to his incorruptibility. Unlike most revolutionaries who gain power, Che did not enrich himself. He lived simply, worked ceaselessly, demanded more of himself than of anyone else. He refused positions of comfort and chose to return to armed struggle when he could have lived out his days in honored retirement. He believed absolutely in his cause and was willing to die for it. In an age of politicians who believe in nothing but power, there is something compelling about such absolute commitment. His critics point to the bodies, the men executed at La Cabana, the guerrillas he led to their deaths in the Congo and Bolivia, the economic policies that failed while he stubbornly insisted they would work, the rigid ideology that could not adapt to reality, the willingness to sacrifice millions in nuclear war rather than accept compromise, the absence from his children's lives in pursuit of an abstraction, the cruelty disguised as revolutionary necessity. Both sides are right. Che contained multitudes, contradictions that never resolved. He was the doctor who stopped healing to start killing, the intellectual who despised intellectuals' detachment from action, the man who preached equality while maintaining rigid hierarchy in his guerrilla columns, the romantic who believed in love while practicing ruthlessness, the idealist who authorized firing squads. What would Che make of his afterlife? The question is unanswerable but irresistible. He would surely hate the commodification, the reduction of his life to an image on merchandise. He would despise the people who wear his face while knowing nothing of his ideas, who invoke his name while living comfortably within the system he fought to destroy. But he might recognize something familiar in the persistence of his image. Che believed in symbols, in the power of example. He tried to make himself a symbol, the new man, the incorruptible revolutionary, the guerrilla who chose permanent struggle over bourgeois comfort. He succeeded in becoming a symbol. The tragedy is that symbols, once created, escape their creator's control.
The romantic narrative is that Che died for his beliefs, a martyr to the cause of liberation. This is true, but incomplete. He also died because he refused to learn from failure, because he could not accept that will and ideology were insufficient, because he believed his own myth. The Congo should have taught him that revolution could not be exported. Bolivia should never have happened. But Che could not stop being Che, the revolutionary who believed action was everything, who thought conviction could overcome material reality, who would rather die fighting than live with doubt. The harder question is whether his life and death accomplished anything. The Bolivian revolution he died trying to start never happened. Bolivia remained poor, ruled by a succession of dictators and corrupt democrats, its inequality as stark as ever. Cuba, the revolution he helped win, survived but compromised, maintaining independence but at enormous cost, preserving certain social gains while denying basic freedoms, outlasting the Soviet Union but never becoming the beacon Che had dreamed. The revolutionary movements he inspired mostly failed. Some succeeded briefly before betraying their own ideals. A few achieved partial victories, land reform here, a change in government there, but nothing approaching the total transformation Che believed possible. The world remains fundamentally capitalist. Inequality has worsened since his death, not improved. The imperialism he fought has evolved but not disappeared. And yet his image persists. Young people still discover Che and feel that electric recognition. Here was someone who refused to accept injustice, who fought back, who believed another world was possible. The specifics of his ideology may not speak to them. The historical context may be foreign. But the gesture of refusal, the willingness to risk everything for something larger than oneself, this resonates across generations.
Perhaps that is his legacy, not the failed revolutions or the theoretical writings, but the example of a person who refused to accept the world as it was. Che looked at poverty and exploitation and said no. He could have lived comfortably. He was a doctor, educated from a good family. He chose otherwise. That choice, whatever we make of its consequences, came from a genuine moral conviction that suffering demanded response. The problem was the response. Che believed that armed struggle was the answer to injustice, that violence was necessary and cleansing, that the new world could be built on the ashes of the old. This belief led him to actions that cannot be defended, to an ideology that justified cruelty, to a rigidity that prevented learning from mistakes. The moral clarity that made him willing to fight also made him willing to kill, not just enemies, but anyone who stood in revolution's way. The question each generation must answer is whether Che's example inspires or warns. Is he a model of commitment to justice, or a cautionary tale about ideology unchastened by doubt? The answer depends partly on who is answering and partly on what they choose to see. For the poor who still struggle, for the young who refuse to accept inequality as natural, Che offers something: the promise that individual action matters, that history is not fixed, that the powerful can be challenged. This is valuable, even vital. The danger is when inspiration becomes imitation, when Che's tactics are copied without understanding that tactics must fit contexts, that what worked in Cuba's particular circumstances will not work elsewhere. The photograph on the wall, the t-shirt in the drawer, the poster in the dorm room, these are not Che. They are echoes of Che, refracted through decades of interpretation and misinterpretation, commodified and mythologized until the man has almost disappeared entirely. To encounter Che himself, you must go to the writings, to the diaries, to the testimony of those who knew him. There, you find someone more complex than either his admirers or critics usually acknowledge. You find a man of genuine courage and genuine cruelty, a brilliant theorist who could not accept when reality contradicted his theories, a loving father who abandoned his children, a doctor who stopped healing to start killing, an incorruptible idealist who ordered executions, a romantic revolutionary who created suffering in pursuit of eliminating suffering, a man who contained all these contradictions without ever resolving them. Che himself might have appreciated the final irony. He became exactly what he fought against. He wanted to destroy the system that turned human beings into commodities. His own image became the ultimate commodity, sold by the very capitalism he despised, generating profits for corporations he would have wanted to expropriate, adorning the bodies of consumers he would have considered corrupted by false consciousness. But perhaps there is a deeper irony still. In becoming a commodity, Che's image keeps alive the idea that revolution is possible, that the world could be other than it is, that injustice need not be accepted. The image has been stripped of its dangerous content. No one is actually going to start a guerrilla war because they bought a Che t-shirt, but it keeps circulating a vague memory that there was once a man who believed in something enough to die for it, who fought against a system that seemed invincible, who refused to compromise. That memory, however diluted, however commodified, however distant from the historical reality, still carries a charge. It still suggests that another world is possible. Che would have hated what his image has become, but he might have recognized that even in its degraded form, it carries a trace of the conviction that drove him, the absolute refusal to accept injustice as permanent.
As sleep approaches tonight, you might reflect on what revolutionary commitment means in our time. We do not face the conditions Che faced. Armed struggle is not our calling, and thank goodness, because the costs are terrible and the outcomes uncertain. But the gap between the world as it is and the world as it should be remains. Poverty persists, inequality grows, the powerful exploit the weak. Climate catastrophe approaches. The list of injustices demanding response is long. What would Che do? The question is less useful than it seems. Che's answers came from his time and place, from conditions that no longer exist,
from an ideology whose failures we can now see. We cannot simply copy his tactics or adopt his beliefs, but we might learn from his example, not the specific choices, but the underlying conviction that one person's life can matter, that refusing to accept the unacceptable is itself a political act. Che believed that individuals could change history through will and action. He was partly wrong. History is shaped by massive forces beyond individual control. But he was partly right, too. Individuals do matter. The choice to fight or to accept, to speak or to remain silent, to act or to passively observe, these choices accumulate and compound and sometimes unpredictably change everything. The revolutionary who died in Bolivia wanted to be remembered as a fighter for liberation. Instead, he became a poster on a wall, an image on a t-shirt, a symbol emptied of specific content. But symbols are what we make of them. The photograph of Che staring into the distance can be a commodity or a reminder. It can be mere decoration or a call to examine our own lives, our own choices about whether to accept the world as it is or to work towards something better. In the end, perhaps the most important thing about Che is not what he did, but what he tried to do. He tried to end injustice. He failed. The methods he chose created new injustices. The ideology he embraced proved inadequate to reality's complexity. His absolute certainty blinded him to his mistakes. His willingness to kill in pursuit of liberation betrayed the liberation he sought. But he tried. He gave everything, his comfort, his career, his family, ultimately his life, to a vision of a more just world. The vision was flawed. The methods were worse. The consequences were often tragic. Yet the underlying impulse to look at suffering and refuse to accept it, to believe that human beings deserve better and to dedicate oneself to building better, this impulse was not wrong. The challenge is to preserve that impulse while learning from Che's failures, to fight injustice without becoming cruel, to commit to ideals without sacrificing everyone to them, to be willing to act while remaining willing to doubt, to understand that the world needs changing while recognizing that we might be wrong about how to change it, to hold moral clarity and intellectual humility in tension, refusing to collapse into absolute certainty or paralyzed relativism. This is harder than Che's path. Che knew exactly what he believed and never questioned it. There is something seductive about such certainty, something almost restful about having all the answers. But certainty is what made him capable of ordering executions. Certainty is what sent him to Bolivia when the Congo should have taught him to stop. Certainty is what killed him and the people who followed him. Perhaps, then, the lesson is not to be like Che, but to learn from him, to take the commitment and the courage while leaving the certainty and the cruelty, to fight for justice while accepting that we might be wrong about what justice requires, to act while remaining open to learning, to refuse to accept the world's injustices while refusing to believe that any ideology has all the answers.
The schoolhouse in La Higuera still stands. Tourists visit it now, a pilgrimage site for true believers and the merely curious. The walls bear the marks where Che was held, the place where he died. It has become what he would have hated, a shrine, a stop on the revolutionary tourism circuit, a commodity experience, packaged and sold. But sometimes, in that small room where he spent his final hours, visitors report feeling something beyond tourism, a sense of the weight of it, a man choosing to die for his beliefs, even when those beliefs had failed him. The tragedy of absolute commitment, the strange nobility of refusing to surrender even when surrender would have been wiser. Che Guevara died on October 9, 1967, but the argument about what his life and death mean continues. It will continue as long as inequality persists, as long as people suffer, as long as the young look at the world and ask whether it has to be this way. The man is gone, the myth persists. And somewhere between the hagiography and the condemnation, between the poster on the wall and the corpse on the laundry sink, lies a complicated human being who believed in something larger than himself and gave everything to it. Whatever else we might say about Che Guevara, we can say this: He was fully committed. He held nothing back. He lived and died according to his convictions. The world did not bend to his will. His revolutions mostly failed. His theories proved inadequate, but he tried with everything he had. That is worth remembering, not to imitate, but to learn from, not to worship, but to understand, not as a guide to action, but as a reminder that action is possible, that individuals can choose to fight even when the odds are against them, that the world is made by human choices and can be unmade and remade by different choices. The photograph will outlive us all. Che's face, staring into the distance, focused on something beyond the frame. What he saw there, the just world he believed in, the revolution he thought was coming, never arrived. Perhaps it never could have. But the fact that he looked, that he believed, that he tried, this remains, captured in silver and light, reproduced endlessly, sold and resold, commodified and mythologized, until the man has become pure symbol. And symbols, unlike men, never die.
Sleep now. The guerrilla rests in his Cuban mausoleum. The image circulates endlessly through global culture. The legacy remains contested. The man himself, with all his contradictions and convictions, has become history, which means he belongs now not to those who knew him, but to those who remember him. Not to the past, but to the endless conversation about what the past means and what it demands of the present. Tomorrow, you might see his face on a t-shirt or a coffee mug. You might see it in a protest held high as a symbol of resistance. You might see it commodified or consecrated, worshipped or condemned. What you make of it is your choice. Che Guevara would tell you that choice matters, that you are not powerless, that the world can change. He would be wrong about many things, his tactics, his ideology, his absolute certainties. But about this he was right. Individuals choose, and those choices matter. Choose wisely, choose with humility, choose with open eyes. And if you choose to fight for justice, fight without becoming cruel. Fight without absolute certainty. Fight while remaining willing to admit when you are wrong. Che could not do this. Perhaps you can. Sleep well. The revolutionary rests. His work, whatever it was, is done. Yours continues.